Hello, everyone. Well, here we are in our second week of reading Moby Dick, and I wanted to say that I have found your comments interesting on the discussion board about how you're coming along with the novel so far. And as I expected, not everyone's going to love this book, but as I said last week, if you finish this book and read it in its entirety, when you're done, you're going to know that you have read a great piece of literature. And some of you have already noted that Melville has an amazing gift of wordsmithing of language in many of the passages. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. This is a kind of a lecture. It says a lecture for chapters 31 through 45, but actually what I'm going to talk about today are some of the motifs that we see in Moby Dick, and I want to begin with that. And if I can just get going here, there we go. A motif is the same thing, in many ways, the same thing as a theme. A recurrent thematic element in artistic or literary work, something that you see repeated over and over again. It also sometimes it sets a mood. It is also, the second definition down there is a dominant theme or a central idea. Moby Dick is an extremely complex book, as we all know, and we know by now. And so there's more than just one theme that runs through the thread of this thing, and definitely a lot of ideas that we see recurring over and over throughout the work. When an author is doing that, he or she is telling us that what it is that they're discussing is important enough to have repetition. So I want to go through some of the motifs today that you're going to be seeing as you read the novel. Some of them we've already seen, others we have not. And I want to say that also in the PowerPoint, I wasn't sure exactly how to do it, but in the PowerPoint you'll see that I actually have taken quotes from the book and I put them in the PowerPoint, and I put page numbers so that you can get to those pages in your own copy of the text and mark those, because you may see them again and some of these things. So anyway, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the different motifs, some of the recurring thematic elements that you see in Moby Dick. And we're going to start with the Pequod is a microcosm of the world. The Pequod is a world of its own, and as we see in throughout the novel, you'll see that not only does a whaling voyage sometimes go for 3 or 4 years, but they have to be self-sufficient, self-sustaining on this voyage. But more than that, more than it's a world of its own, a small world floating across the vast sea, it's also a microcosm of the diversity of the world. In chapter 36, I believe it is, you see that the Pequod is made up of sailors from all over the world, and so it's the crew represents nationalities and races from throughout the vast world. And so therefore, really what you have is a microcosm or a small view of the world itself when you see the Pequod. So think of the Pequod as this, not only as a ship, but as sort of this, self-sustaining, isolated world that's floating through the Atlantic and eventually into the Pacific. Another one is, we've already talked about it in last week's lecture, Ahab is heroic qualities. He's the classic tragic hero, and I think I asked you last week to sort of watch and see how this plays out. If you look at those characteristics again of the classic tragic hero, I think that you're going to see that Melville meant for him to be considered a hero, sort of a classic hero, an epic hero, if you will, in the same way as Gilgamesh and Beowulf and on down the line. But we also have Moby Dick's heroic qualities. As I think I said last week, if you're going to have an epic and you're going to have an epic hero, you have to have an epic foe. And chapter 41 is where we're introduced to Moby Dick. And if you'll notice, he is used in the description of Moby Dick. The same words are used that we saw in the description of Captain Ahab in chapter 28. And this comes from page 155 in chapter 41. But even stripped of these supernatural surmisings, there was enough in the earthly to make an incontestable character of the monster to strike the imagination with unwonted power. For it was not so much his uncommon bulk that so much distinguished him from other sperm whales, but, as elsewhere thrown out, a peculiar snow-white wrinkled forehead and a high pyramidical white hump. These were his prominent features, the tokens whereby, even in limitless uncharted seas, he revealed his identity at a long distance to those who knew him. Ahab is described as a pyramid, as Moby Dick is. Ahab has a slender white scar that goes across his forehead, and you'll see him constantly being described as having a wrinkled brow. And you also have, with Moby Dick, a foe or a character that's whose reputation, like Ahab, precedes him. He already has almost mythical qualities. Now, don't get me wrong, Moby Dick is not science fiction. He's a real whale in this novel. All right, but he has a reputation that makes him mythical. In fact, there are some places in the novel where they say some sailors believe that he is immortal. So you have the heroic qualities of the whale going along with the heroic qualities of Ahab to create this great epic. Another motif is madness and monomania. Ahab's increasing madness is becoming apparent as the novel moves along. In chapter 36, in the quarterdeck, when Ahab is nailing the doubloon to the masthead, Flask and Stubb are standing together over to the side, and Stubb says, "Do you mark him, Flask?" whispered Stubb. "The chick that's in him pecks the shell. 'Twill soon be out." Of course, that's a marvelous metaphor, talking about the madness that's inside of Ahab, pecking at the shell. "Twill soon be out." Even as men realize that Ahab is unstable. On page 139 of the same chapter, Starbuck confronts Ahab and said, "Wasn't it Moby Dick? Isn't he the one who took your leg?" And Ahab responds by saying, "Who told you that?" And then he answers, "Yes, it was Moby Dick that dismasted me. Moby Dick that brought me to this dead stump I stand on now. Aye," he shouted with a terrific loud animal sob like that of a heart-stricken moose. Sure signs of impending insanity. And then we see Starbuck again confront Ahab when he says, "Vengeance on a dumb brute," cried Starbuck. "That simply smote thee from blind instinct. Madness, to be enraged with a dumb thing. Captain Ahab seems blasphemous." The idea that, here we have the three mates of the ship, Flask and Stubb and now Starbuck, all realizing that this captain that they're stuck in the middle of the ocean with is going insane. Can you imagine what that must feel like? And then in chapter 37, even Ahab himself realizes that he is going mad, but he still has enough sanity to realize it. He says, "They think me mad." Starbuck does, but I'm demonic. I'm madness maddened. This idea that I'm more than mad. I'm personified madness. Then we see Starbuck say in his little soliloquy in the next chapter, chapter 38, he said, "My soul is more than matched over man, and by a madman." And as the novel progresses, you'll see that Ahab will retreat further and further into his madness. And another character that's going to pop up later by the name of Pip. And you'll see Pip also goes mad, and we'll see for what reason. And that Ahab identifies with this other character, and both of them have lost their wits, basically. So madness and monomania. Monomania means that you're obsessed with something, and of course we know that that Ahab is obsessed with revenge upon Moby Dick to the point where he doesn't care what or whom he hurts. Another motif is the ambiguity of the color white. How did you like chapter 42, the whiteness of the whale? Quite often I've had students tell me it was a difficult chapter to get through, and it is difficult because it's one of the chapters where Melville philosophizes, or Ishmael, philosophizes about the symbolic value of color. And I think I mentioned last time, if not I should have, that the symbolists like Melville and Poe and Hawthorne use color for symbolic value. And, you know, blackness often symbolizes death, red often symbolizes passion. And what does white symbolize? Purity in many ways, but more than that, when you have something that whiteness is the total what is it? The total presence of color, or the total absence? I'm not sure which. But anyway, the idea that, you know, things that are not supposed to be white, like you know, albino animals and things like that, cause tremendous curiosity. But they also have, you know, take on some sort of mythical qualities, and that's what he's talking here about, is this whiteness, the whale. If it would have been if Moby Dick would have been a normal dark-skinned whale, he would not have the same mythical aura about him that he has because of his whiteness. So the ambiguity of the color white, and we'll see this as we go on further, you know, in the novel. Another motif is the gam. And I think it's chapter 52 when we have our first gam. And a gam is the meeting of two whale ships at sea, and sometimes they would last for 2 or 3 days. And what it was is a time for the sailors to get together and actually have a party weekend, if you want to call it that. You know, the rum would come out, they would party, you know, for 24 hours. The captains would get together and talk about where they had seen the whales, and sometimes there was the gam would be with a ship that's going out fresh to sea, like we see with the Pequod, that really doesn't have any whales yet, and the other ship might be heading homeward bound with a full ship of whale oil. And so the captains have these conversations about, you know, where the best whaling ground is and things like that. Also, it's a time when they, interestingly enough, they exchange their mail. When the Pequod was leaving Nantucket, it probably somebody came up and said, if you run into, for instance, the albatross, or as we see later with the Jeroboam. Took me a minute. With the Jeroboam, that somebody came up and said, if you see the Jeroboam, would you make sure that this letter gets to one of the sailors named Macy? And so really, what the whaling ship was a letter carrier, a mail carrier. So there's lots of communication that goes on with the gam, and it's really the only time that, you know, these people have a chance to communicate with the outside world. The Pequod has 9 of them. 9 different times where it meets up with a ship, interwoven throughout the novel, and sort of almost a unifying factor. Another one is interrupted or failed communication between humans, and this sort of goes with the gams, with the 9 gams of the Pequod. You'll see with each one, something happens or there's some circumstance that causes either the communication between the captains to be interrupted or between the ships, or totally failed. And I think we saw this when it met the Albatross. What happened when the captain of the Albatross was going to speak to Ahab after Ahab asked this famous line, "Has seen the white whale?" And you see the captain of the Albatross raise his trumpet to answer, and the wind blows, and he drops the trumpet into the sea, and there's no communication. Some of the communication failures will be because some of the ships are of other nationalities. We'll run into a German and we'll run into a French ship, where language barriers causes failed communication and other things. Every one of them, of each of the 9 gams, there's some sort of failed communication or some sort of interrupted communication between them. Melville dealt a lot with what the catastrophic results of humans not being able to communicate with each other. Another motif is the use of drama devices. We see stage directions, especially in chapters 36 through 40. We see soliloquies from each one of the 3 of the major characters. You know what a soliloquy is. When a character speaks alone on stage, like Hamlet's to be or not to be, that is the question. Or Macbeth's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. Those are when a character is alone on stage, and the only one that hears the character speaking is the audience. No other characters on the stage or in the play or in the novel are supposed to hear it. That causes a problem, of course, if it's a real soliloquy and Ishmael's telling the story. He must have heard the soliloquy to be able to tell the story. But anyway, in chapter 37, you have Ahab's soliloquy, and the stage direction is Ahab sitting alone, gazing out. In chapter 38, we have Starbuck's soliloquy, where he stands alone in his cabin. Stubbs' soliloquy, where he's standing alone on deck. In chapter 40, it's like a musical on the deck of the Pequod, with each member of the crew having a speaking part. You see that long litany of characters, from different islands and different places in America, and this diversity that's on the ship. But more than that, it's almost like a stage production. In fact, there has been a stage production done of the entire novel, Moby Dick the musical, and I think you can actually find parts of it online on YouTube. So he uses all these dramatic or drama devices to make it so that the world, or that the Pequod, is almost like a stage, And wasn't it Shakespeare who said the world is a stage and we are just mere players on that stage? And I think that's sort of what he's doing. Also, the idea that these soliloquies and things really sort of remind you of the Shakespearean tragedies, with those tragic heroes. So there's a lot of use of drama devices in here. Another one is another motif is the loom of life, the difference between fate and free will. Ishmael first mentions fate near the end of chapter 1, where he says on page 21, "But wherefore it was that after having repeatedly smelt the sea as a merchant sailor, I should now take it into my head to go on a whaling voyage. This the invisible police officer of the fates, who has a constant surveillance of me and secretly dogs me and influences me in some unaccountable way. The police officer of the fates, though I cannot tell why. It was exactly that those stage managers, the fates, put me down for this shabby part of a whaling voyage, when others were set down for magnificent parts and high tragedies, in short and easy parts and genteel comedies, and jolly parts and farces, though I cannot tell why this was exactly." And what we see here is Ishmael is a believer in fate, more than he is in free will. The idea that the fates are the ones who put him on the Pequod, and it was fate that brought him to Nantucket, and it was fate that caused him to meet Queequeg when he did, and that he happened to get on the Pequod, which was the ship that was going to be captained by a madman. And he talked about the fates, those stage managers, the ones almost like humans are part of a play, and that we have stage managers who sort of rule our lives. He was much more of a believer in fate than he was in free will. And in chapter 47, the map maker, when Ishmael and Queequeg are weaving the mats, and you have this wonderful metaphor of the loom, and that Ishmael discusses the roles of fate or chance and free will in the lives of humans. And of course, you can see there in the photograph the three fates. Cletho spins the thread of life. You can talk about the thread of life. Spins the thread of life. Lachesis determines its length, and Atropos decides when to cut it. And that the fates are really in total control of our lives, and that we have very little control over what happens to us so very little free will. Very interesting. You'll see this throughout the novel also. Another motif is the land versus the sea. Beginning in chapter 1, Ishmael contrasts them throughout the entire novel. And we'll see some of this later on, but the idea that the contrast of people who love the sea and people who love the land, the monsters of the deep of the sea, and almost the mystery of the sea compared to the certainty of the land and things like that. Another motif is the quest. All great, not all great, but many great epic heroes have a quest. They're on some sort of a quest to destroy evil, a quest to to find the Holy Grail, whatever. Ahab's journey comes seen as a heroic quest, and of course, a heroic quest trying to avenge what he considers a terrible wrong, but also in his own mind thinking that he is destroying evil in the world. Another motif is civilization versus savagery. Ishmael is conflicted throughout the novel about the dichotomy of Christianity and paganism, and we see that very soon in the novel when he meets up with Queequeg. He tries to come to terms with it in chapter 3, The Spouter Inn, which is supposed to be a humorous scene, and I see some of you have written that you didn't see any humor in the book. When Queequeg crawls into bed with him, into bed with Ishmael, I think Melville meant for that to be humorous, as he's crying out for the landlord coffin to come save him, and all the mix-up that goes there. But